Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with Jim Dine and Sam Sackeroff, part of the program series New York Between Art and Life. The Gertrude and David Fogelson Lecture is presented in conjunction with the exhibition New York 1962 to 1964, on view at the Jewish Museum through January 8th, 2023. And we encourage you to visit if you are able to do so. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Throughout his long career, Jim Dine's vast and varied output has included paintings, assemblages, sculptures, drawings, prints, and over 12 books of poetry. Dine moved to New York in 1958, and together with Klaus Oldenburg, was a pioneer in the happenings and performances of that time. He participated in the 1964 Venice Biennale and Documenta4 in 1968, and had his first retrospective at the Whitney Museum in 1970. The accolades and acknowledgements of his contributions to the arts are as diverse as they are numerous, from Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters, a Medal of Honor from the British Museum, to being named to the Accademia di San Luca in Italy, to name a few. Today, Dine is principally based in Paris, working in sculpture and painting. Sam Sackeroff is the former Lerman Neubauer Associate Curator at the Jewish Museum, where he was part of the curatorial teams behind the exhibitions Afterlives, Recovering the Lost Stories of Looted Art, and New York, 1962 to 1964. His work has been supported by numerous agencies, including the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. It is my pleasure to welcome them to present this conversation.
So Jim, I wanted to start by thanking you for making time to speak with us. As our viewers will know, this conversation is occasioned by the exhibition New York, 1962 to 1964, which is on view now at the Jewish Museum in New York. You can see the introduction gallery there on your screen now. And here's an installation shot with one of the three works we're fortunate enough to have of yours in the show on the right there, Tattoo. The other two works that we'll be discussing today are Thief Number 1 and Four Rooms. I also hope to be able to talk a little bit about your relationship both with Alan Solomon, who was the director of the Jewish Museum in the early 60s, and your relationship with Germano Celant, who, as you know, was the curator of this exhibition at the JM. But first, I was hoping to talk a little bit about your arrival in New York. You were born in Cincinnati, but started making trips to the city in 1956. Do you remember how you sort of spent your time during those early trips, what you were seeing, how whether you were seeing works that struck you or meeting artists? How were you spending your time during those first trips to the city?
I would come from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, where I was an undergraduate. I would come once a month if I could with other people, two or three other people. We'd drive. Somebody would have a car. We'd drive all night. We'd come to the city, and we'd go for 2 days. We'd go to galleries and museums. That's all we did. That's the reason we came.
Right.
And the guide we had, when none of us were from New York, well, the guide we had was Art News, Tom Hess's Art News, which I discovered. This is in the foothills of the Appalachians, and it was a very primitive art department, but with wonderful people. And nobody knew anything. And I don't think they certainly didn't read Art News, the professors. But I found in the library bound copies each year back to just after the war. So I stole them all and went through them like a Bible. I memorized them. It's the first time I saw Rauschenberg. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that what I had been like an embryo thinking about, that everything was possible, that I could use the objects that I had grown up with and call it art. I mean, I was shocked by Rauschenberg. I actually never saw a combine on all those trips. But we did see Jasper John's first show with the targets and the flags. That's the first time I saw Jasper's painting in the real, the encaustic. It was very, very inspiring. The way he painted, and then the next show that had false start in it, the oil painting where he painted like Titian. I would read Letter from London by John Russell, and I learned about Anthony Caro, for instance, as a figurative artist, and also as an assistant of Henry Moore's. We went to go to the Stable Gallery. We went to 10th Street. It was just totally inspiring for me, and I knew I was going to end up back in New York. But I'm not to say that it wasn't productive in Athens, Ohio, because it was just like having a studio. The professors never made me go to class. I became an artist there. I mean, a full working artist there, because they allowed me to just paint. And I'm forever grateful for that. New York was also, it was just the city, the street. You know, it was not what it is now. It was something very specific. It had one foot in immigration. I mean, Eastern European immigration. And it had, it was extraordinary. It was as though I was Islamic and making the Hajj.
Right. I've read interviews where, so by 58 you're showing in New York at the Judson Gallery, and by 59 you've met Klaus Oldenburg, and your comment on the street reminded me of a comment that you've made a couple of times, sort of recollecting sort of midnight ventures that you would make with Klaus out onto the street to go sort of scavenging for material. Can you tell me a little bit about those nights?
Well, in 58, I re-met a man I went to high school with, Mark Ratliff, and he lived at the Judson student house. And he said, he was a student at Cooper Union. I'd never even heard of Cooper Union, you know, but meanwhile, I had a little baby. I had my first child, and I was teaching grade school, and this guy, Mark Ratliff, said, why don't you come down and see the Judson student house? We got a space down here. The minister wants to make into a gallery. And so I came down, and he said, you know, there's a guy who works in the library in the stacks at Cooper, and who is having a little show right now of drawings called Klaus Oldenburg. And he was interested in having a gallery, and he said he'd like to come over. And I said, well, let's meet him. Also, by the way, at Cooper at that time was Tom Wesselman, who was also from Cincinnati. But Mark and I knew him, and he was older than we were. And Wesselman came over, and there began a conversation. Klaus and I began a conversation about what we dreamt of, about what we dreamt for ourselves, really, as artists. Klaus was not what I would call a young artist. He was already worked as a newspaper man. He had gone to the Art Institute. He was a Yale graduate. He was highly educated. All the things I was not. I was an autodidact.
Right.
But we made a connection the connection was about the city, about a romance, about the detritus of the city,
right,
about what the city was like in those years. The Judson was in Greenwich Village, and all we had to do was walk over 10 blocks to the Bowery. And in the wintertime, you know, there'd be arms and legs sticking out of the snow of bums.
Who had frozen during the night.
Dead people, frozen.
Right.
And there was garbage everywhere. And we got a baby carriage. I remember we found a baby carriage, and we wheeled it around and picked up crap. And it became very clear that everything could be made into art. But I already knew that when I was 2 years old, when I saw a hammer for the first time. It was as good as red paint, you know. And
Right.
Anyway, Klaus was ambitious. I was ambitious. His ambition was very much more sophisticated than mine. Plus that he had a secret weapon, and nobody gives her enough credit. And that's Patty Mashinsky, his wife. And
Right.
Patty was the driving force behind the sewing of all the soft sculpture, behind everything. She was
Right.
he called her his little Orphic Annie. She was really Kali. She was a
Right.
woman who was on fire and had a destructive side, but was a wonderful, wonderful woman, wonderful person. I love Patty. And inspiring, but she was really his muse.
Right.
And I mean, whatever came later with Klaus and his partnerships with women did nothing, did nothing compared to this. This
Right.
woman was an artist herself and got no credit for it.
Right.
I mean, if there was going to be a partnership, it should have been that rather
Mhm.
than what came later.
I'm thrilled that you're mentioning her, and she also worked closely with you or was involved with some of your work happenings and such
She
as
performed
well.
in some of my performances. She
Right.
performed in the car crash.
Right.
She was a terrific actress.
We'll get to some of this in more detail in a moment, but I just wanted to ask, do you remember, you said it goes back to when you were 2 years old. Do you remember why the sort of emotional force of the revelation that a hammer was as good as red paint, or that everyday objects?
I do.
Could you describe that a little bit? Because
It was what I would call an object of desire.
uh-huh.
It was a basic form, that I felt in my hand that had been evolved through the working of men's hands.
Mhm.
And that's all I can say. It struck my unconscious at 2 years old. The reason I say 2 years old, I always romantically said that, but the other day, one of my sons showed me an old home movie he found in his mother's basement that my father had taken when I was 2. And I am playing with a hammer and a piece of galvanized pipe.
Right.
And that was my whole life.
And we should just say that for those of you who don't know, your father owned a hardware store and your grandfather owned a plumbing goods store.
It worked like this. My grandpa and his brother owned it was called the Save Supply Company in Cincinnati, and they serviced plumbers and carpenters and builders. So it was a builder's supply, but on a very personal one. It was no Home Depot, I assure you.
Right.
But it was they sold just that. And when my father married my mother, they set my father up in a little store across the river in Covington, Kentucky, and where eventually I would go every Saturday to work when I was 7 and 8. And to work, I didn't do much work. He gave me a few things to sort through some nails and stack some pipe and things. And fortunately, I was a strong child, and it was a lot of manual labor. And I got a sense that, everybody I met worked with their hands.
Right.
And these were people who were nice to me and rough people, but there was beauty in them. I thought their skin was beautiful. None of them bathed much, so there was always the marks of working on their hands and on their faces, grease or paint. I met a lot of house painters.
Right.
And my father had a pipe cutting machine, electric one, and cutting galvanized pipe. I mean, in those days, there was not plastic pipe. And the floor was embedded with the shavings from this, which was like the night sky. And I mean, there was all kinds of stuff like that for an 8-year-old who was destined to be an artist. Then in high school, after I had left my father's home and went to live with my grandparents, I was on my own. My mother had died when I was 12. I would work every Saturday in my grandpa's store and all summer. And I mean, but now I'm working like an adult. I mean, I worked with the shipping people. I worked with the people who filled orders. I was a janitor. Anyway, I had the opportunity to be with these sensational objects of desire. And so by the time I got to New York, or I was conversant with what William Seitz called assemblage,
Right.
the art of. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a painter, and I also wanted to be an object maker.
It's such a profound, some of your comments, seeing the shavings on the ground and having them look like the night sky, the degree to which the world, from what you're describing to me, seemed like the whole world carried an aesthetic charge for you. Is that fair to say, that the whole world felt?
That's exactly. You
Right.
heard what I said.
Yeah. No, I think it's a beautiful, and I think such a profound thing to say, not only in its own right, but also at the time, because that idea was really becoming articulated when you arrived in the city by yourself, by Klaus, and by others. I know that some of the early, we can move to.
How about Jean Follett?
Of course.
Yeah.
And some of the early shows that you're participating in, whether it's Six Painters in the Object that Lawrence Alloway organizes at the Guggenheim, or the New Realists exhibition that Janus organizes at his gallery, were sort of seeing, were attempts in some way to articulate this interest in objects. Did you feel that they
also new forms, new media, Martha Jackson?
Of course, which is where you were represented at Jackson before moving to Janus. Is that right?
Correct.
Right.
But that's exactly right.
Yeah. And so did you feel that that discussion around objects, I think John Ashbery, the poet, wrote in the New Realists exhibition catalog that objects formed a neutral language or a common ground. Did you feel like those comments were sort of getting at how you thought about objects, or was it a bit different?
Listen, I love John until he died, but it wasn't like that.
Tell me what it was like.
There was never a common ground. It was an individual's, it so happened that it was a zeitgeist of this sort of thing. I mean, there was a reason why there was this show by Seitz of assemblage that Klaus and I were left out of, but where he noted the performances, because the performances we're making at the time were like the living example of what these other people were doing. He got it slightly wrong, the things because a lot of the things, people in his show used them more formally than we did. For us, it was a visceral thing,
right?
As garbage is opposed to something new,
right?
So I mean, for the show I had at Rubin Gallery, a one-man show at Rubin Gallery in, I think, 1960, I'm not sure. Everything was made from what I picked up outside my building on the street at the time of garbage. And in those days, it wasn't a scrupulous garbage collection,
Right.
And so it was there all the time, or people just put stuff out on the street. And that show was made. And one of the things was, I remember I picked up a bed spring, which eventually I made into a piece and showed in that show. And then I gave it to Alan Capro, and who eventually sold it to the Guggenheim. That's one of the few things that exists. if it does exist at the Guggenheim, if they've cared for it. What else you want to say? What do you want to talk about? Let's go a little further with the Judson.
Sure.
Klaus and I decided that we would divide it into the street and the house.
Right.
And that suited me fine. He was totally involved in the street, totally. And he and Patty performed a very unusual, I would say, performance of dance and the objects. And he painted it in a grisaille fashion. And it was beautiful what he made. On the other hand, I picked up all the garbage that we had collected, and I built a house inside the Judson, and I started the practice of writing on everything. Right. And at that time, I wrote in a tautological way, the house for the house, and et cetera, et cetera. But mine was much rougher.
One of the ways that I've heard that the street and the house described is Klaus kind of took care of the outside, and you were much more interested on the inside.
I was interested in my unconscious.
Right.
Was the inside.
Right.
I want to also say that at the Judson, I met someone who I felt was so talented and she gave me so much inspiration, and that was the critic Jill Johnson.
Oh, of course.
And she was a force for a lot of people, I guess, but I don't care about a lot of people. With me, she followed me, and we spoke, and it had nothing to do with her career or mine. It was we spoke on an equal ground about what I was doing, and she's the one who really was the champion of the car crash performance, which I'll talk about in a minute. She really was championed the car crash, so much so that she drove me crazy about repeating, how about doing another one? How about doing something else like that? And I didn't do anything until 1965. I mean, I just couldn't. I had enough. I did four different performances, and that was enough for me. This is all. It was such a rich time that it's difficult to speak about it almost.
What was it about? What did Johnston sort of understand or intuit about your work that other people didn't, that made her such a special and important interlocutor for you? Did she pick up on something in your work that was?
No, we did this. There was nothing that specific. It was more like we were relatives and we had shared some kind of family trauma.
Sure. Speaking about, Johnson is a great critic of dance, among other things. And you were talking about sort of interiority and things like that. I've got on the screen here the earliest work of yours in our show, Tattoo, which was part of the Six Painters and the Object exhibition. One of the things that's so remarkable about this work is the sort of relish in the act of painting, it seems. After you sort of paused doing the happenings in sort of 58, 59 and 60, am I right in understanding that you really turned your attention for a period to painting very deliberately?
That's why I stopped performing. I wanted to paint, and I made a series of paintings, one of which was called Hair,
right?
One of which was called Tattoo, and the tattoo is just that,
right?
But it really, and you're right, it gave me a chance to move the paint around, and I made that one night.
It looks like you were using your hands. Is that right? You were,
of course.
Yeah.
In the red band, well, there was a painting called The Red Bandana that I painted completely with my hands, and went to buy more red paint, and the guy around the corner who sold it, the color store, said, you can die from that. That's toxic material. It never even occurred to me.
Right. Do you remember what the impulse was to sort of get into painting in a much more deliberate way after the happenings around 61? What was it
What was
about?
the impulse? I was always going to be a painter. I
Right.
I thought very stupidly at the time, or even before I got to New York, that de Kooning and Klein were the natural inheritors of Picasso, Matisse, and that's the way the world was going to go. And
Mhm.
I thought that Bill de Kooning's paintings were it just was the best thing I could think of. And when I went as a student and saw what's he called, John Beverly Hale at the Metropolitan Museum, I think he was the curator of American art. He bought in bulk, I think he bought Pollock's Autumn Rhythm. And when he bought de Kooning's Gotham News, when I saw Gotham News, I just about fainted. And the
Right.
idea of how he blotted the newspaper onto the thing, once again, reinforced. Rauschenberg didn't just go to erase a de Kooning for no reason, you know.
Right.
De Kooning was between him and immortality.
Right.
I thought that Bill had a great touch, and
Can,
so many intelligent ideas.
right.
So many. Klein, on the other hand, in his black and white time, just struck me as a really brave man.
Mhm. Did you feel much, a lot is often made of a sort of generational sort of break or rupture between de Kooning, Pollock, the Abex group, and sort of your emerging generation. Do you feel that that's accurate, or was it more in common?
Well, it's very obvious that we didn't paint the same way, you know.
Right.
And but I saw Guston's show at Sidney Janis in the mid-50s in one of my trips, and I saw the paintings called Beggar's Joy. It was the greatest use of paint I had seen up to that moment.
Mhm.
The paint was so important.
Right.
Guston never painted like that again.
I saw those. I think some of those works were shown. Maybe it was at Matthew Marks or somewhere downtown a few years ago, and yeah, they really knock you out. If we can just stick on tattoo for one more moment, one of the things that's always struck me about this painting and uncrating it and seeing it sort of in the flesh, as it were, when we were installing, was this sort of interesting space that it occupies, kind of between a sort of inside and outside. The skin is one of those boundaries between our interior selves and sort of the world we sort of move around in. The skin sort of shows marks from our body and also receives marks from outside, which, a tattoo is a mark impressed on the body from outside. Are those sort of inside outside ideas, were they on your mind? They came up a little bit with House, maybe. Did you ever think about your relationship to your body as a kind of subject of real interest, or am I reading into things?
Oh, I certainly thought that my body was a subject of interest. I thought that since my whole work seems to be a self-portrait,
Right.
of course my body, and of course I'm 87 years old. My whole life I've chronicled the organic change of the organism,
Right.
my own personal. But that's not what this was about. This was, I didn't feel the needle and the dye going into my arm.
Right.
This had to do with words, which I'm devoted to as a poet. And this had to do with the obvious, to name it tattoo. It doesn't say Mary or Jane,
Right.
or, and it's not a cross. Tattoo is the tattoo.
Another,
but I will say this, I'll tell you just a little aside.
please.
I taught one summer in Salzburg in the 90s with Nan Golden. And so it was so obvious. She she said, "That's the greatest painting you ever made. I just saw it at MoMA."
Yeah.
And of course, that was, I mean, it was her era. I mean, the beginning of everybody getting themselves mutilated, you know.
Right.
So, but that's not what it was about. It was just like when I made the painting Hair, as Ivan Falstrom said, that I was involved with tautology, you know.
Right. So the word is the thing that it's
Yes, the
referring
word
to.
was the thing.
Right.
Exactly.
So in that sense, there's a kind of words become objects too, in a certain sense, a material
Without a doubt.
thing.
Without a
Right.
doubt. I mean,
Right.
It even now when I finish a painting, then I title it,
Right.
because that's another part of the painting. That's an object for me.
You can see, I mean, and for people who have been to the show or have seen the work at MoMA or elsewhere, the word really does have, it's a material element of the painting. It's not
Yes.
it's
Yes.
dug into the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Fantastic.
like it's like Morandi being called still life. I mean, it's
right.
You know.
Another thing that strikes me as you're talking about this, and maybe we can carry it into the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which was a little bit more of your interest in objects. But by writing tattoo as you did in the work, you kind of make the word yours. It's no longer an anonymous word. The letters all themselves become, in a way, self-portraits.
That's partly because of handwriting, one's own handwriting. It was my hand, which has held me in great stead all these years.
Right. That's an understatement. Can we, I think you've said a number of times, and this is the next work that we, of the three that we have in our show. And as you can see, here's a great example of you using objects. I've read elsewhere that you said when you pick up an object, especially if you do something like apply paint, you make that object yours. Objects are personal in your work, not impersonal things. You spoke a little bit earlier about how objects were loaded with childhood memories. Can you say a little bit more about how objects are personal to you, and why that's been important?
When I choose something to use, I don't choose it. It chooses me.
Sure.
It like jumps into my hand. It jumps into my mind or my line of vision. I don't just go around and look for objects. They come to me. It's what I feel is appropriate to use. Therefore, there is a collective memory in them.
Right.
The ones I use.
Does it feel that they're sort of collaborators? Would that be too much to say? Or because that's a very evocative thing that an object.
No. They're not collaborators. They become the tools for me that allow me to speak about unspoken things.
Right.
And things that cannot be translated in the English language, but can be spoken about unconsciously and can resonate hopefully in the viewer's body.
That's one of the things I was hoping to ask.
Like Dan just said, like a brushstroke. They are like a brushstroke. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I've also read, this is, as you see, Thief number 1, and I believe there are 4 Thief paintings. Is that right?
There were 4.
And I've also heard you say that being an artist was in some way like being a thief. It was taking from the world. Do you remember, does that comment ring a bell? Do you remember?
No. The paintings are, the word thief. I wanted to underline it. I was being psychoanalyzed, and I was coming to terms with the fact that, well, frankly, my father stole my childhood from me. And when my mother died, I became a man, and I was on my own. And I was on my own, and so I wanted to talk that way to myself.
Right.
And I think it's a very provocative word. And I went to I remember going to the hardware store. I remember going to the hardware store on Broadway and finding this font, this kind of faux Oriental Arabic font.
Mhm.
And I instead of using something more Occidental to write it out, I used this. It was more exotic. And I still feel like that. It's more like drawing,
Uh-huh.
but it refers to this larceny that took place.
Right. That's also very, that speaks to also the sort of personal sort of resonance that objects have for you. The fact that these objects, which are in some sense become autobiographical when you use them in a painting. That's just such a rich idea. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that experience of seeing an object and having it register so viscerally as sort of speaking to you about such a deeply personal part of yourself.
I was making a series of paintings three summers ago in Paris in my studio, and I as is my wont, I paint a lot with electric tools.
Mm.
I use grinders to move the paint around and to, well, just to get in and erase and etc. And I was using this grinder on the painting, and it took part of my finger off, and I ran out. Went to a doctor. I had to have stitches. There was blood everywhere, but the grinder remained. It was faulty, so I put it in the painting. Therefore, it already was a personal object, and it for me held a lot of power, to say the least. And that is an example of what you've just spoken about.
Right. Not to jump too quickly, but my understanding is that Alan Solomon was one of the first people who recognized that sort of deeply psychological and sometimes sort of uncomfortably intimate aspect of your work. And you've said in the past that he not only recognized it, but made it a virtue, including sort of elements of works that other people would think of as upsetting or ugly, that he saw all of this as part of the richness of your project.
Yes.
Can you talk?
He came to see me. I don't know who sent him. He was the director of the museum at Cornell University, and he came to see me with his curator called Inez Garson. Mm-hmm. And he had already visited Rauschenberg for years.
Right.
He was a very intelligent guy who understood my painting immediately and bought a piece, and so did Inez. And his collection, I don't know, when he died in 1971, was disseminated by the heirs. But Inez's piece, I think, was given back to the museum at Cornell. And those were works that were really made from the street. Mm. He validated me and he validated my intention of painting autobiographically. Right. That it was okay to do that. That didn't have to always be a formal painter, that the subject matter of your unconscious was as good as anything, if not rich.
That's one of the reasons that he, and I think you agreed with this, if I understand correctly, avoided the term pop because it was too impersonal. It didn't attend to any of that autobiographical content.
Without a doubt. I mean, I mean, it was so easy to say I was a pop artist. It had nothing to do with it.
Mhm.
Nothing to do with it. I was almost an outsider artist. You know, I mean, I was within myself,
Right.
and he got that. He got that enough to put me with people I respected in the Venice Biennale in '64. You know,
Right.
he
Um,
for me it was a great tragedy that he died,
mhm.
because he could have seen me into my middle age and
Right.
maybe understood and explained that. So
Right.
I had to go. I had to go, and I felt like I had to go it alone without Alan.
He was that important to you. He
Oh
felt,
yeah,
and you were his neighbor. You lived in the same building for a time. Is that
yes,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but not at that time. But
In
where he died, yeah,
right.
or
Um,
7th Avenue.
there were so many other strange in retrospect, because they've sort of gone out of fashion, interests that Solomon had. I wonder if you could comment on them. He was somewhat skeptical of the avant-garde, and especially of the sort of collapsing of artists of your generation into sort of European avant-garde models. He didn't like the term neo-Dada, for instance. Was that something that you thought about? Sort of
Well, I mean, I didn't like the term neo-Dada, not like he didn't,
right,
because I think in his own ambitious way, he would like to have been, well, he was the guy who presented
right,
Rauschenberg, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he had a big ego.
right.
It didn't bother me. I just thought it was silly.
Why was
I
it?
mean,
Why was
it
it
had
silly?
nothing to do with Dada,
Right.
and it, you know, um, I would have said Fluxus had more to do with Dada
Uh-huh.
than what everybody was doing. Um, he was very unusual. I mean, he and I spoke. I remember this. He was hard. He was the first deaf person I knew, and he was
Mhm.
having an operation at Mount Sinai for something in his ear. And I happened to run into him on the street. He was walking. It was Upper Madison Avenue. He was walking to Mount Sinai to have the surgery, and we had a long conversation about Ellsworth Kelly.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how it came up, but we both agreed that Ellsworth Kelly was not a formal painter. He wasn't what Barbara Rose wanted him to be, or the apologists for abstract art. That he painted out of a similar interest in himself and what he saw and what he could speak about through painting, rather than admitting it, as it were.
Right. Do you remember having a sort of any opinions about abstraction versus realism? I think Klaus participated in a panel on the sort of the place of the figure in contemporary art. And one of the things he sort of was talking about was whether art would go in the direction of metaphysics or realism. Did you feel that you were a realist? I think you've said that you felt like you were inheriting a realist tradition. Does that still feel accurate, or?
Well, I mean, what's a realist tradition? Jan van Eyck? I
I
mean, what
think
do you,
Pito, for instance.
I know. I was a huge fan of Pito.
Yeah,
Horace Pippin,
right. Do they still
where he
feel
Horace Pippin, when he put objects around, like gas masks and thing, around a frame, around a painting, because he had been gassed in the First World War. I thought I was in, I guess, I always thought it was nothing that particular.
uh-huh.
Pito was great. Haberly also. I
I
Because I was an American, I
right.
wanted to be in the tradition of Pito or Arthur G. Dove or etc. But really, I came out of European painting. I
Interesting.
came
That
out,
was
I came out of looking um, at the Met
mhm,
and at the cloisters
mhm,
of European painting, and mainly Northern European painting.
mhm.
And
Um, Another, before we, I hope to ask you a few questions about Germano Celant as well. But the third work that we have in our show, which was at the Venice Biennale, which Solomon organized, is the incredible 4 Rooms. One of the things that I was really struck by, again, engaging with the work in person, is how many ways you're handling paint. There's, you cover the upholstered chair in paint, and then it looks like you're using the cushion to stamp, to impress the texture of the cushion itself on the panel on the left there. The center panels seem to be wholly abstract. What do you remember, was these different handlings of paint something that you were sort of preoccupied by when you were making the work, or were other concerns?
Well, I think it's a glossary of terms of my painting.
Yes.
And what you think is the impression from the cushion was what's on the cushion. I made a stencil, and then I stenciled that onto the acrylic paint of the chair, and then used it behind it to repeat it, to resonate, and to make a relationship. The panel next to it, it was the first time I could do what I really wanted to do. That was try to see how David Smith made the surface of the sculpture. I loved the way David Smith ground down the metal. And this was my secret tribute in a way, but also how do you do it, And so I tried that. And then the white panel was purely a way to make white on white painting. Purely, as though I had no right to do it by itself. It had to be in the context of these common objects. And the final one, the shower, is a kind of a painterly interpretation of a shower. So it is all about painting, and all about what the surface can hold. But it's also about black and white. Bob Rauschenberg visited me when I had just finished it, and I'm only telling you this because I read about it in a magazine. He said he went out to Rosenthal's, which was an art supply store on Broadway, and he bought a roll of canvas, and he did Barge after this. After seeing this, I was very flattered. Very flattered.
Actually, Barge was there's a famous photograph of Rauschenberg at the opening of the retrospective at the Jewish Museum, and you may have seen it. They're all standing in front of Barge. Truly one of the sort of monumental pieces in his career. One of the sort of, you say there's a sort of glossary of terms. I'm struck so much by how painting, there's sort of, your hand is so evident in 4 Rooms, but also it's almost as if the object has a hand too. You sort of meet the object halfway in the painting, whether it's sort of allowing the shower head to prompt those expressionistic strokes on the right, or making the stencil based on the chair. I just have to say, when we uncrated this and we're installing it, it really was it was a truly thrilling to see it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then I wanted to end just by asking you a little bit about your relationship with Germano. You worked with Germano many times over the course of your career. He, for our visitors who don't know, he organized a major retrospective at the Guggenheim. Do you remember when you met Germano, or what struck you? Would you say a little bit about him?
I met him through Ileana, and in the late 60s in Paris. And he was a young critic from Genoa, and I liked his name a lot.
Sure.
And I liked him, but I didn't see him a lot until the 80s. We went to Spain together to see her collection. I think Madrid or Barcelona. And then of course he was instrumental in Art of Povera, and there was always the talk that my work shown at Sonnebein in Paris was an influence to begin Art of Povera for the younger Italian artists. I mean, I was very flattered by that because I liked them very much, particularly Pier Paolo Castellari, very attached to his work at that time. And then I met him then we had made the show at the Guggenheim in the late 90s and became quite close. And he also showed me at the Venice Biennale in 97.
Right.
And in a very free way, he allowed me to choose what I was going to show, and he respected it and did it. And it was a pleasure. And then working with him on the Guggenheim was easy. And the last time I saw him was because of the show. He came to see me in Paris a week before he died. Right. And obviously it was a shock to everybody that he died, but he really was one of the first people to die from COVID like that, you know?
Right.
He was vigorous to the end. When I saw him, he came to the studio. We had a wonderful meeting, and really spoke to each other like old friends, but he understood what I was doing now. And to me, it was a shame and a loss, you know. Mm-hmm. I missed him. I miss him. He was one of the last standing people of interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a real honor to have the conversation that you and Germano had in Paris, published in the catalog that accompanies this exhibition.
Yeah, I liked it too. I was pleased about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of your time, and you've already been very generous. Unless there's anything else, Jim, that you'd like to mention, I think this has been really productive. It's certainly been a thrill for me. I'm sure it'll be a thrill for everybody who's able to watch. Is there anything else you'd like to say about either the works that I've shown or this period?
No, I think we honed in on what's important for the show, and there's plenty more to say, but let's make another show then, you know.
Great. Fantastic. Well,
nice to meet you.
Likewise. Thanks. Thanks for making the time. It's been a real pleasure. Okay.